This was it, the moment everything changed. A single press, and she would be walking into a world she could never escape. The air felt suffocating, her soul screaming at her to stop. But as another weak cough escaped her mother's lips, the sound like a knife to her heart, Jenny knew she couldn't wait any longer. Her thumb pressed down. The moment Jenny pressed send, an icy chill ran down her spine. She had done it. There was no erasing the message, no pretending she hadn't made the decision. Her hands trembled as she clutched the phone, waiting for a response. Seconds stretched into what felt like eternity. Her stomach churned with a mixture of fear and regret. What have I done? Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Amaka. Good choice, Jenny. Mr. Charles will send a driver to pick you up in an hour. Be ready. The words felt final, like a door slamming shut on her last bit of dignity. She stared at the message, her breath coming in shallow gasps. An hour? That wasn't enough time to think. Wasn't enough time to change her mind. She looked around the room. Her mother still lay unmoving, her siblings still fast asleep. They had no idea what she was about to do. Would they ever forgive her? Would she ever forgive herself? She bit her lip hard, tasting blood. This wasn't about forgiveness. This was about survival. About keeping a roof over their heads, about making sure her mother didn't die because of her pride. Her hands clenched into fists as she stood up and walked toward the tiny mirror nailed to the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, broken, desperate. She swallowed the lump in her throat and wiped her tears. If she was going to do this, she had to be strong. There was no turning back now. The clock was ticking, and soon the car would arrive to take her to a place she never thought she'd go again. Jenny stood outside the tiny house, her heart pounding as she waited. The air was thick with tension, the kind that wrapped around her throat and made it hard to breathe. Her siblings were still asleep, and her mother had barely moved. She had told herself she would leave quietly, but now, standing at the doorstep, she hesitated. A part of her wanted to run back inside, to pretend she had never sent that message. But the sound of an approaching car froze her in place. A sleek black vehicle pulled up in front of her. The tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but Jenny already knew. The driver stepped out, a tall man in a black suit, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, just opened the back door and gestured for her to get in. Jenny's hands clenched into fists at her sides. This was it. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. With slow, heavy steps, she walked toward the car. Every step felt like another piece of her soul breaking away. Just before she slid into the seat, she took one last look at her home. The peeling walls, the tiny window, the place that had held so much love despite the suffering. Would she ever see it the same way again? Would she ever see herself the same way again? The door shut behind her with a soft click, sealing her fate. As the car pulled away, Jenny stared out the window, watching her home fade into the distance. Guilt sat like a stone in her stomach, but she forced herself to push it down. She had done this for them. For her family. But deep inside, a voice whispered a painful truth. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about her. About how far she was willing to go. And she had just crossed the line. Jenny left her lecturer's office with a new sense of purpose, but reality quickly reminded her that hope alone wouldn't fill an empty stomach. As she walked home, her siblings' faces flashed in her mind. They were still hungry. Her mother was still sick. The scholarship might change her future, but what about now? She reached home to find her landlord standing at their door, his face hard with anger. "Jenny, I warned you. If you don't pay something by tomorrow, you're all out." He didn't wait for a response before stomping away. Her youngest brother tugged at her dress, whispering, "Are we going to sleep outside?" Jenny knelt and hugged him tightly. "No, I'll find a way." But she had no idea how. The walls were closing in on her again, and the temptation of fast money crept back into her mind. Mr. Charles's words echoed in her head, "Call me when you're tired of suffering." She sat outside, watching the sunset, battling the voice inside her. She had rejected the darkness once. Could she stay strong again? Desperation forced Jenny to make a bold move. That night, she snuck out and headed to a wealthy neighborhood, hoping to find work as a cleaner or housemaid. She knocked on doors, swallowing her pride, explaining her situation to strangers. Most people shut their doors in her face. Just when she was about to give up, an elderly woman answered. "You need a job?" she asked, looking Jenny over. She hesitated, then nodded. "Come inside." The woman's house was grand, the air thick with the scent of luxury. Jenny clenched her fists. "I need someone to clean my house 3 times a week," the woman continued, adjusting her gold-rimmed glasses. "It won't be much, but it's honest work." Jenny almost cried in relief. She would take anything. She agreed immediately. As she left, she felt something strange. Was this what hope felt like? But deep down, she knew this wasn't enough. The hospital, the rent, the food. Her problems were still too big. Jenny worked tirelessly for the next few days, scrubbing floors, dusting furniture, and running errands. The pay was small, but at least she could buy food. Her siblings finally had a decent meal, and for a brief moment, there was peace in their tiny home. However, the hospital called again. "Your mother's condition is getting worse," the nurse said, her voice tight. "She needs urgent treatment." Jenny swallowed hard, gripping the phone. She had only saved a fraction of what was needed. That night, as she counted her meager earnings, Amaka sent another message. "Still suffering? The offer is still open." Jenny clenched her jaw and deleted the message. She had made her choice. She had to stay strong. But as the days passed, her mother's condition worsened, and the rent deadline loomed. How much longer could she hold on? Jenny's employer noticed her exhaustion. "You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders," the old woman said one evening. Jenny forced a smile. "I just have a lot on my mind." The woman sighed. "You remind me of my daughter. She was stubborn too, but she never asked for help." Jenny hesitated before whispering, "I don't have anyone to ask." The woman studied her before disappearing into a room. She returned with an envelope. "Take this," she said, pressing it into Jenny's hands. Jenny's eyes widened when she saw the crisp bills inside. 100,000. More money than she had ever held legally. "It's not charity," the woman added. "Consider it an advance on your salary." Jenny felt tears burn her eyes. She wanted to refuse, but she knew this could save her mother. For the first time in weeks, hope didn't feel so impossible. Maybe she had finally found her miracle. Jenny clutched the envelope in her hands, her heart pounding. This money could buy her mother more time, but it still wasn't enough. The hospital bills, the rent, the endless cycle of suffering. She was drowning. She tried to push away the dark thoughts, but they crept in like shadows. Was I wrong to reject Mr. Charles? Would I still be suffering if I had accepted? She hated that the thought even crossed her mind. Later that night, as she sat in the dimly lit room with her mother sleeping beside her, her phone vibrated. A new message from an unknown number. "Jenny, I hear you've been struggling. If you change your mind, the offer is still on the table. This time, double the price. Think about it." Her fingers tightened around the phone. Double the money? She felt sick. Why wouldn't they leave her alone? Jenny deleted the message, but the words haunted her. She tried to focus on her cleaning job, but every moment felt heavy with temptation. One afternoon, she saw Amaka waiting for her outside the mansion where she worked. Dressed in expensive clothes, looking well-fed and carefree. "Jenny, I know you hate me right now, but just listen." Jenny folded her arms. "I have nothing to say to you." Amaka sighed. "I get it. You're trying to be strong. But while you're scrubbing floors, your mother is dying. Your siblings are starving. What's the point of suffering when you can end it?" Jenny wanted to scream. She hated that Amaka had a point. "I can't do it." "Why not?" Amaka pressed. "What's stopping you? Your pride or your fear?" Jenny turned and walked away, but the words followed her home. That night, Jenny sat in the darkness, replaying Amaka's words. What was stopping her? The first time, she had run, but now the stakes were even higher. She picked up her phone and stared at the last message. Double the price. Her mother coughed violently in her sleep, and Jenny's heart clenched. What if she didn't survive? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. And then, before she could stop herself, she typed, "I'm ready."
The next night, Jenny arrived at Mr. Charles's mansion, her legs shaking as she walked through the doors. The air felt heavier than before, suffocating her with the weight of her decision. Mr. Charles smiled, as if he had expected her all along. "Welcome back, Jenny." She nodded stiffly, her hands balled into fists. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because she had no choice. He gestured toward the familiar private room. The the same room where she had once run from. You know the deal. Jenny swallowed hard and stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Jenny stood frozen, staring ahead. Her body refused to move, her mind screaming at her to run again. Mr. Charles watched her carefully. You're not ready, are you? She forced herself to speak. I need the money. He smirked. Then prove it. Her stomach twisted, and for a moment, she thought she would vomit. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out every thought. And then, just as the pressure became unbearable, her phone rang. She grabbed it like a lifeline. It was the hospital. Her mother's condition had worsened. She was dying. Jenny bolted out of the mansion without a second thought. She had wasted too much time already. If her mother died while she was here, she would never forgive herself. She arrived at the hospital out of breath, her lungs burning. The nurses were rushing around, trying to stabilize her mother. You need to make a deposit now, one of them said. Jenny's hands shook as she pulled out the money she had. It wasn't enough. Not even close. Tears filled her eyes as she looked down at her mother's frail body. She had made her choice. Now, would it cost her everything? Did she take a right decision? Please subscribe and like for more stories.